representing the Labour Party this morning, His Majesty's opposition. Did you have a thought on what we were just hearing there?
Good morning. Well, obviously, if there is any evidence of profiteering, that really needs to be clamped down on. And so it's quite right that there's an investigation to get to the bottom of this. I think particularly in the middle of a cost of living crisis, when so many people are struggling, when we've seen food prices still gone up by about 10%, just over recent months, we really do need to make sure that action is taken if there is unfair practices going on. OK,
something else that the Greeks potentially want to have investigated is why Rishi Sunak cancelled a meeting with the Prime Minister at the last minute. What's Labour's view?
Well, we feel that ultimately it's really important when it comes to our relationship, especially with our NATO allies, that we have a statesman-like response to this. There are really important critical issues to be discussed internationally, whether that's with the Greek government or with other NATO allies, obviously issues around our national security, also around the economy, the Middle East situation at the moment. And Keir Starmer met with the Greek Prime Minister, and actually he focused on those issues. He focused on those issues critical for our country's interest. And yet we seem to have had from the Prime Minister just a stamping of feet and a slightly petulant walking away. And that really isn't the standard of behaviour that we should expect from a Prime Minister of our country.
Would you give the marbles back if you were in power?
Well, obviously, that's an issue for the British Museum to be sorting out, working with the Greek government.
And also the government of the day. I mean, so if you were the government of the day, would you condone giving back the marbles?
Well, my understanding is that actually George Osborne, who of course was a politician, isn't anymore, that he's been working with the British Museum to try and sort out a way through this. I think it is for cultural institutions to be determining the way forward on this, rather than politicians to be dictating on this.
It's up to the government, isn't it? It's up to the government whether or not they agree. Rishi Sunak has said absolutely out of the question. Is it something that you would consider if you were in power?
Well, we think these are issues for cultural institutions to decide. If a deal was reached between the British Museum and the Greek government, we're not going to stand in the way of that. But ultimately, this is something that cultural institutions should be sorting out. And I think the big question is why, at a time of global insecurity, at a time when we need to be having strong relations, especially with our NATO allies, why did we see our Prime Minister potentially threatening those relations as part of a, frankly, quite thin-skinned and childish response, it seems?
Want to talk about small business this morning?
Yes, absolutely, because small businesses are the beating heart of local economies. But at the moment, for many small businesses, actually life is getting a lot harder rather than easier. Labour has set out our plan for small businesses. We're touring that around the country with roadshows that are starting off today. And we really want to see action being taken quickly to back our small businesses. Action on late payments, big issue for so many small companies. We want to scrap business rates, replace them with something that actually supports our small businesses based in bricks and mortar far better. We also want to see action against antisocial behaviour, because when I talk with small business people based on our high streets, the biggest issue that they mention is antisocial behaviour and retail crime. We'd have those town centre patrols and neighbourhood policing brought back so that we actually get a grip and clamp down on that antisocial behaviour.
Are casualties in Gaza too high?
Well, obviously, far too many innocent people have been killed over the last few weeks, and this has been, I think, an absolutely horrendous time. We've all been seeing it on our television screens, and whether that's the appalling terrorist attacks by Hamas on Israel or the humanitarian catastrophe that's taking place at the moment in Gaza. And, Labour did call for substantial humanitarian pause. We called for that along with international partners. We want to see that extended, both so that all the hostages...
Still further than where we are now. You want it to be extended further past today?
Well, yes, we do want to see an extension because we want to see all of the hostages released. We want to see that desperately needed aid going into Gaza in the middle of that humanitarian catastrophe. And we also need to see those steps being taken forward in the space that exists at the moment, those steps being taken towards ultimately the political and diplomatic solution that we need to see so that there can be a cessation of fighting. Far too often, I'm afraid, Western countries have talked about a two-state solution. They haven't done anything to foster it. That's got to change, and we've got to see that intensive work taking place right now.
So just to clarify, Labour's position is they would like the pause to continue until all of the hostages have been returned home.
Well, I don't think there's any question about Labour's position in terms of hostages being returned. We've been really clear from day one that they all needed to be released.
The pause to continue until the hostages are returned home.
Well, we do want to see all of the hostages released, and we have called for that extension of a humanitarian pause. We've called for it both for the hostages to be released, also for those humanitarian purposes that I mentioned, and to provide that space to move towards those steps, ultimately, for a political and diplomatic solution to this crisis.
As long as it takes? How long do you want this pause to continue for?
Well, quite frankly, I think sat in this studio here in London, where we're very safe and secure, I don't think it's right to be pontificating, frankly, just sat here around these issues.
Because you were saying, and you were talking about all the hostages need to come home, and I'm just asking whether Labour's position this morning is that you want the pause to continue until they've all been returned home to their loved ones.
Well, Keir Starmer did set that out, actually, just a few days ago over the weekend. He was saying we need to make sure, ultimately, that we are seeing that space being provided so that the hostages can be released, but also so that we get that humanitarian aid in, and also so that we build that space towards taking those first steps to, ultimately, a two-state solution. But I would just say that, actually, the power to release those hostages is in the hands of Hamas. We want to see them releasing all of those hostages. I think we've seen those really, really moving scenes of parents who've been reunited with their children. But of course, then the pain of those families who haven't seen their family members returned, just as we've seen the pain of families in Gaza with their, for example, children who've been killed and having to pull those children out of the rubble. Those are scenes that should not be taking place anywhere. We need to be working towards, ultimately, that long-term two-state solution.
OK, we're out of time, sadly, but hopefully you'll come back and see us soon. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Dodds.